Chapter 11. At Home in Michigan. Their first child, a little daughter, was born the following fall on September 22nd, 1922. They named her Ruth Hathaway. The previous May, Margaret had made a trip back east, where she remained with her mother and sister for 6 weeks. Lloyd was very lonesome while she was gone, but when she returned in June, accompanied by her darling mother, his joy knew no bounds. Lloyd was very fond of his mother-in-law. Someone remarked once that they didn't know who he was in love with more, Margaret or her mother. However, she was very thankful that there was such an intimate relationship between her mother and husband. Her mother remained in Coloma until 2 weeks after Ruth's birth. The two new parents were thrilled over the birth of their first child. She had been born at home, but Margaret had the care of a good nurse and an excellent doctor, in whom they all had great confidence. After Mrs. Hathaway's return east, Margaret and Lloyd assumed their duties as parents automatically. She had an excellent book on baby care to consult, which her sister had used with her babies, and she read it faithfully. It seemed to answer any question she might need to know about the new baby. From time to time they came to live in Coloma until they had left in 1925. Lloyd and Margaret worked diligently in the Congregational Church. He was superintendent of the Sunday school and had a large class of boys. Margaret started a beginner's class and worked in the Women's Ministry Society. Besides teaching in the Congregational Church School, she played for the Methodist Church and directed its choir when it held its services in Coloma every other Sunday night. At this time, Coloma and Watervelt Methodist churches were on the same circuit, with one pastor serving both parishes. Margaret also joined the Cloverleaf Club, which was a very fine study group, and Lloyd became active in the Berean Country Sunday School Association. When Ruth was 9 months old, her father met with an accident while playing tennis early one morning. Lloyd had found a very good tennis partner in the town banker, and it had been their custom to get up early and play a good game of tennis before breakfast. One morning, Lloyd fell and sprained his ankle. The doctor told him it was as bad as a break, and that he would have to give up his work for several weeks and stay completely off his feet. They got him some crutches and were looking forward to a bleak summer when Margaret got the idea of packing their trunk and going to Connecticut for the duration. Lloyd liked the idea. So the three of them took the train and went east, much to the delight of Margaret's mother and her Connecticut relatives. Margaret loved her hometown of Suffield, and the contagion had spread to Lloyd, who came to be infatuated with New England also. The next summer, Margaret and Ruth again left Lloyd to spend a month in Suffield. Ruth was nearly 2 years old and was a very dainty little miss. Margaret's mother came to Coloma to visit later that same year and remained until after Christmas. Previous to her coming, the Zoskis had moved to a more convenient bungalow with better facilities. Margaret was still using a large iron range in her kitchen and doing her big washing by hand, using a sink scrub board and a hand wringer, and boiling all the white clothes in a big copper boiler on top of the stove. But they had a bathroom now, which they did not have in their other house. The fall that Margaret's mother was there, Margaret was out in the driveway beside the house washing their car one sunny afternoon, and Ruth was with her safely on the inside of the car with the door closed. Margaret went inside to wash the windows, and when she was finished she backed out of the door, slamming it behind her. Ruth, who was not quite 2 years old, was standing on the back seat and supposedly secure. But when the door closed, Margaret heard a grating sound and something crack. A shrill cry rose from her little daughter, and she quickly opened the door and picked up her little girl, who was screaming with pain and fright. Blood was issuing from her hand. And much to Margaret's horror and distress, she beheld 2 of Ruth's tiny fingers on her left hand, all but severed. The injury had occurred near the first joint of the middle finger and ring fingers, which were hanging by a thread of flesh. Margaret quickly gathered up her baby in her arms and held the little hand gently in one of her palms and dashed to the back door. She called frantically to her mother to open the door and sobbingly told her what had happened. She was sure the fingers would have to come off and that her darling daughter's hand would be deformed for life. Her mother, who was always very calm in any emergency, thought differently. She was sure the fingers could be saved. Lloyd was out of the town and could not be reached. "I'll call the doctor," her mother said. Fix a solution of Lysol and water first, and I'll bathe Ruth's fingers while you call. Oh, I do hope Dr. Brown is in, Margaret said. He will be, her mother assured her. These are his office hours. Good old Dr. Brown. He lived in the next town, but he left his patients and hurried quickly to the aid of the stricken baby. It was he who had delivered the child 2 years before, and he was fond of this little family. At one time he said to Margaret, "You and your mother have more common sense than anyone I have ever seen." Margaret was still crying when he arrived. She was rocking her baby, trying to comfort her. The doctor wasted no time in setting up his operating equipment. While Margaret held the baby steadily on the table, he skillfully sewed each precious finger together again. Then he applied 2 splints, one to each finger, and bound them loosely together. "Now we'll just have to wait and let nature take its course," the good doctor said. "I'm sure they will all mend all right. And she's so little that the scar will hardly be noticeable once she's grown up," he added reassuringly. Margaret and her mother thanked him for his promptness and comforting words, and he was gone. These were the days of the general practitioner, when busy doctors made house calls and had time to spend with their patients too. They were endued with a little knowledge about a lot of things. This was the time before the day of specialization, and country doctors seemed able to meet every emergency and medical need that arose. Late that afternoon, Lloyd arrived home from Dowiac. Margaret was still crying, but her thoughts were diverted from her child for a moment when he came in bringing a red wooden wagon for his little girl. This wagon had lasted a lifetime, and now, with another set of wheels and a new coat of paint, it was being used and enjoyed by a second generation. Well, it took the parents and grandmother several days to get over the shock of this accident. Of course, Margaret blamed herself, but Lloyd was so comforting and understanding that she felt absolved from all guilt. He told her it was purely an accident and assured her that, as far as he was concerned, he did not hold her guilty. Naturally, she felt better and was grateful for his big-heartedness, although it took her a long time to get over the great distress it had caused her. "We'll pray for our baby's fingers to heal. God will take care of this matter, I know. You and I must see her fingers perfect again. You have done all you can, and so has Dr. Brown. Now we must be patient and wait," Lloyd told his distraught wife. So they prayed silently and together, and the little fingers did heal perfectly without any infection setting in, and only a thin white scar left to remember it by. Ruth was so young that her hand developed, the fingers grew to the normal size. As Margaret's mother returned to her home in Suffield shortly after and did not visit them again for nearly 3 years, Margaret was trying to keep up with her music. She had several advanced piano pupils and played every other Sunday night at the Methodist church. She felt particularly indebted to John J. Bishop, her music instructor back east. So one day she wrote him a letter telling him so and thanking him for introducing her to so many inspiring compositions of the great masters. She received the following reply from him a couple months later. Springfield, Massachusetts, April 6, 1922. My dear Margaret, your kind letter of several weeks ago has only just reached me, owing to the fact that I have a near namesake who got it and failed to send it to me. I'm greatly delighted to hear from you and to know you are so happily situated in your new home. I'm very glad to know that you are not giving up your music. It is a great pleasure and help to know that you feel as you do about your study with me, and I thank you for telling me about it so kindly. With wishes for you both, sincerely yours, John J. Bishop. When Margaret's mother returned to Coloma in the spring of 1925, it was with the intention of helping Lloyd and Margaret move to Benton Harbor, where Lloyd had accepted a position with the Nolian Lumber Company. Another baby was well on its way, and Mrs. Hathaway knew that her daughter would need help in packing and getting ready to move. Lloyd had found a suitable bungalow for them to buy, which was in the process of being built at 721 Ogden Avenue. When Margaret and her mother looked at it, they thought it was very attractive and appropriate for their needs. So the deal was consummated, and the little family moved in May. They had ample furniture and rugs with which to furnish their new home. When Lloyd and Margaret were married, they had salvaged some lovely pieces of old furniture that had been in their family for many years, which her mother gave them. Some of the chairs and chests of drawers, which had been painted white, they had restored and refurnished. At the time, they were unaware of the value of their lovely antiques would acquire in the future. There was a cherry highboy which belonged to Margaret, having been given to her by her aunt Sarah Jerome, who was Mr. Fred's sister. This Connecticut highboy with cabriolet legs dates back to around 1735 and bears the original finish and original escutcheons and handles. It is an historical piece as well as a rare antique, for it contains a jagged hole in both ends, front and back, of the middle drawer in the lower section. This was made by a British bullet during the War of 1812. At this time, the highboy stood in Old Jerome House in New London, Connecticut, which is located on the harbor at the mouth of the Thames River near the lighthouse. There was no battle at New Ludington during this war, but the British did sail into the harbor and fire on the town. One bullet struck the side of the Jerome house, piercing the highboy. Another lovely piece of furniture which her aunt had given Margaret was a mahogany Sheraton drop-leaf table. She decided to use this for their dining room table until they could get a larger one. For this they purchased a set of Dutch Windsor chairs, consisting of the host chair and 5 side chairs. Lloyd sent Margaret the money to buy whatever furniture was needed before their wedding. So when they moved from Coloma to Benton Harbor in May 1925, they were able to furnish their new home most attractively, although they did not yet realize the worth of their possessions. They had inherited them more or less because of necessity and did not realize the value attached to them. However, Margaret never sold any of her lovely things, and it was not long before she met a woman who belonged to the Antiquarian Society, Mrs. Harold Benning, who came one day just to see her antiques. She was appalled to find Margaret's precious Connecticut highboy separated, with the flat-top chest of drawers being used in a bedroom as a dresser, and the lower part, or lowboy, being used in the dining room as a buffet. But as soon as Lloyd came home that night, and Margaret told him about Mrs. Bennington's reprimand, he agreed that it should be kept as one unit. Consequently, it was promptly put together and placed where the lowboy had been standing in the dining room. It looked so well there, and it was in such a prominent place that Margaret was very grateful for Mrs. Bennington's constructive criticism. From then on, Margaret and Lloyd's eyes were open, and they began to buy books on antique furniture and learn to love and appreciate the beautiful pieces with which they were privileged to live. It was not long after Mrs. Bennington's visit that Margaret was invited to become a member of the Antiquarian and Historical Society of Old St. Joseph on the Lake. They had moved into their new home in May 1925. Milton Hathaway, their first son, was born at Mercy Hospital on July 10th, 1925. Dr. Carl A. Mitchell was their physician. He allowed Lloyd to go into the delivery room and to watch the birth of the new baby. This was a rare experience for a father. However, Lloyd managed to hold up well during the delivery, and Margaret was delighted and relieved to have him by her side. Imagine Margaret's great joy when the doctor held up her baby for her to see, and she heard him say, "Behold your son." Their joy at having a male child knew no bounds. It was wonderful for them to have a boy now that their little girl was nearly 3 years old. He was a very good baby and easy to handle all through his babyhood and childhood. Margaret's mother, who had spent nearly 3 months with them, returned east as soon as her daughter was able to take care of the responsibilities of the family again. Margaret had spent 10 days in the hospital, most of the time immobile, as was then the practice for maternity patients. As her mother departed, Margaret had a premonition that her mother was not well, and it was a sad parting. It was the last time her mother ever came to Michigan. The following June 1926, Margaret took her 2 children and went to Suffield on the train. Lloyd bade his little family farewell at the railroad station at Kalamazoo. There was a big lump in his throat as the train left, bearing the 3-person tears to his heart, but he knew how much it meant to Margaret to go back home for a visit. He knew he could count on adding a week or 2 on to the duration of the visit originally planned. for it seemed to him that she always wrote begging his leave for an extension of her visit every time she went east. The Clivers no longer lived in Kalamazoo. They were now in Detroit, where Dr. Cliver had a pastorate. It had been planned that Margaret and the children should stop off to pay a short visit on their way east. Margaret had packed a little blue valise of Ruth's with crayons and color books and other items with which to keep her little ones busy on the long ride to Springfield. They took a taxi from her aunt's home to the railroad station, and when Margaret got out of the taxi, she inadvertently left the bag behind. When she discovered the case was missing, it was too late to do anything about it. Luckily, she had taken a whole section, both upper and lower berths, and the children behaved very well. Milton, who was 11 months old, gave everyone who passed their seats a big smile and got a great deal of attention from the passengers. Margaret had secretly planned to be home with Lloyd on Milton's first birthday. They had been gone over a month, and Lloyd was delighted to see them. Little did they know that within 3 months they would be returning to Suffield. An urgent telegram came from Agnes in early October saying their mother had a serious operation. She had not been well all summer, but the emergency operation came as a surprise to all the family. Margaret and Lloyd waited anxiously for further word. When it came in the form of another telegram within 2 days, it was a real shock. It revealed that her mother's condition was critical and that she would not live long. It urged them to come at once. Margaret got someone to stay with the children and hastened downtown to do some last-minute shopping. Among other things, she bought herself a large black velvet hat with a beautiful pink facing around the brim. They hurriedly packed and got very little sleep that night. The next day, they were off again on the train for Connecticut with their 2 children. A neighbor and a friend of the family met them at the train. He took Margaret directly to Springfield Hospital, where her mother lay critically ill, and then drove Lloyd and the children to Suffield. Her mother lived almost a week longer. Some of the family stayed at the hospital night and day, and she was so ill that it was impossible to communicate with her, and it nearly broke Margaret's heart. She did so want to show her mother her pretty new hat, but even that was impossible now. She was too ill to enjoy such frivolities. These things were unimportant now. Her mother was dying. Finally, Mrs. Cliver came from Detroit, and Margaret, who had developed a very severe cold, was forced to go to Suffield, where Agnes was living in the old homestead with her family. Word soon came of her mother's death, and Margaret was crushed. Furthermore, she was so ill, she was still in bed, and on the day of the funeral she was unable to go to the ceremony. The funeral was conducted in the old home on East Street, in the house which was Emma's home ever since she had married Fred Hathaway nearly 50 years before. The same minister who had performed Lloyd and Margaret's marriage, Dr. E. Scott Farley, officiated. He made a most remarkable prayer which eulogized her mother and told more about her selfish life than the sermon he preached. She was buried beside Mr. Fred on the hillside cemetery back of the Congregational Church at Suffield Center. It was 3 years before Margaret and the children went east again, in June of 1929. Margaret was expecting another baby in December. She was born on December 4th at the beginning of the Great Depression. They named her Carolyn Louise after a dear friend of Margaret's. When Lloyd took Margaret to Mercy Hospital that morning, there was no time to lose. She was put to bed in a private room, at that time the nicest memorial room in the hospital, called the Sheffield Room, in memory of the donors, Mr. and Mrs. William Sheffield. Both the delivery room and the operating room were occupied that day, and the babies simply could not wait. So after Margaret convinced the nurses this was so, they quickly assembled their necessary equipment and summoned Dr. Carl Mischel, and Carolyn was born without any fanfare. Or was it?